You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week, we're joined by Yvonne Yeung to talk about ULI's recent report, Building 15-Minute Communities, a Leadership Guide. We chat about how the guide can help create good development that reduces the need to drive and supports our climate emissions reduction goals. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the Talking Headways podcast, especially through your podcatchers. With the unfortunate news that Stitcher will stop operations on August 29th, we hope you'll continue to listen on other services. You can find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Pocket Cast, TuneIn, and many, many more. We'll put our RSS feed in the show notes if that helps you make the switch. Thanks again for listening to Talking Headways. We really do appreciate it, especially those of you who keep coming back each and every week. Yvonne Yeung, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I have 23 years of experience, primarily helping the public and private sector leaders to create complete community. So I was in touch with Urban Land Institute actually when I was a student. At that time, I was studying landscape architecture and really trying to understand, is there anything we can do beyond design that can help to use public spaces to revitalize economy? So through that, I had 10 years in the private sector and primarily helping government agencies to think about how they can use infrastructure to shift the way that we are doing development. And I think what's exciting is over the last 10 years, I was actually part of the government sector. So I helped two local municipalities, helping them when they're making a major shift. So at that time, there's policy in place saying that there's a focus on transit. There's policy in place saying that the shift of economy is more towards innovation economy. So in other words, the way we're designing cities need to do a complete shift. So through that, it's very exciting, helping different departments to think about how they can shift the decision making from a more kind of drive-to automobile base to a walk-to base. So I think that's a focus of our conversation today.
Awesome. Well, let's go back in time a little bit, though. I'm wondering what got you interested in cities?
Yeah, so when I was 6 years old, I grew up in Hong Kong. At that time, the city was building the coastal line, the subway. So I was fascinated just looking at the construction site, looking at a lot of new opportunities happen within a very short period. So I think it was between 4 to 5 years, I can see really how the city transformed. And every time when there's new development comes in, it provides new amenity as well. And I was very curious because I love observing how people interact, particularly because of the shaping of the public spaces. People are more cohesive, people integrate, and people just get a lot more activities happening. And I think it's a major shift for me when my family immigrated to Canada when I was 14 years old. And it was a little bit of shock in the beginning because the whole structure of the city seems to be surrounding the automobile. In other words, there's more cars on the street than people. So that's a major shift.
And all of this was when you were 6 years old. You thought of all this.
When I was 6 years old, I spent a lot of time thinking about the future. And I was thinking that if I grew up and get a job just building cities, that would be the coolest job ever.
Oh, so now you have the coolest job ever.
Yeah, I'm fortunate. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your report, Building 15-Minute Communities, a Leadership Guide, done through ULI. I'm wondering, what was the impetus for this report?
So what's interesting about the Urban Land Institute is that we have a combination of public sector members, private sector members, and also real estate, and also community leaders as well. So this is primarily a voice from our membership. So we did a survey. It was during COVID. And what they say, they see there is tremendous opportunity to reshape how we are integrating infrastructure with development. So that's how this initiative gets started. So it's part of the Curtis Infrastructure Initiative, and it's funded by Jim Curtis, a developer from San Francisco. And he believes that infrastructure and development has the opportunity to shape people's lives. It's all about people. So through that, for this, we put together a report and primarily trying to think about what are the key things that we can do over the next 7 years. And I think why we see this is significant is that we know from a planning standpoint, over the next 7 years, we will be building at a minimum 10 billion square feet of new developments. And we have a choice to make whether we're going to put those in auto-oriented area or we're intentionally putting those into more dense mixed uses, walkable neighborhood. I think the reason why Urban Land Institute is drawing the energy to do this report at this critical time is at the same time, we see $1 trillion of infrastructure investment coming to North America. Majority of them is coming to the US. There are some of them coming to Canada as well. And the key is what is interesting about these infrastructure dollars is that it provides a seeding fund. And for the very first time, giving people opportunity to look at infrastructure differently.
It's so interesting because we do have all this money and, Congress basically doles it out to states and cities around the country, but you all are trying to figure out a way to structure it so that we get the most out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we noticed, the biggest challenge based on our survey, and also we run infrastructure forum as well, is the decision making. So therefore, the report, which is now available on the URI website, and anybody is welcome to just Google 15-minute communities, a leadership guide. You'll get access to 2 pieces of information. One is a set of slides that we put together, helping people to have that constructive conversation. Another is the report. So primarily, our product is very simple, basically using a 3-tier decision system. First is trying to understand what is the best way to align some of the new policy. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of new policy come out in November of last year. And many of those is provide a solid foundation in terms of how we are making infrastructure decision. So for example, the first one is 30-30 conservation. So that is focusing on protecting 30% of land and water by 2030. So both US and Canada is very clear in terms of making that goal. So what it means for us is that we can create nature in the city. We can be intentional about growing back our forests to deal with some of the flooding and heat issues. The second policy is Justice 40 initiative. Is intentionally putting that to allocate 40% of the funds to fill in any of the transit and service gap, particularly for equity perspective. So we know, for example, in certain areas, there's red line district. In certain areas, there is older neighborhood that in the past, they didn't get the attention and the priority having the infrastructure dollars. So the Justice 40 initiative is primarily fitting that goal. Healthy people, 2030. So I'm a professional planner, urban designer, landscape architect, and I also have an MBA. So this to me is very exciting, which is for the very first time, we have something tangible to measure. How do you define a healthy community? So the Healthy People Initiative have very clear measure, particularly looking at built environment, how that translates even to education performance, the social performance, the health performance, and also looking at how it can improve the lives of people from different ages as well. So I think some of the challenges we're facing at the moment is aging population. A lot of millennial families is having young children, but it's lack of the support basis. So what we're going to do? So that would give us a very clear to measure what we need to do and how we can get to a more possible outcome. Another one is decarbonization. So our goal is to reduce at the very minimum 50% by 2030. So from that standpoint, is that it's really for real estate to take the leadership from that standpoint. So it's not just on material, meaning like using no carbon material, but it's also about clean energy, removing parking, reducing the waste, but also a big chunk of the carbon is coming from auto-centric behavior. So therefore, using the community model, and we call it a 15-minute community, primarily is making it in a way that you can walk to all your daily needs within 15 minutes. We believe that that model can be a model for decarbonization at a community scale. So if you imagine, the messaging is that instead of decarbonizing building by building, you are decarbonizing at a community scale. So that is very exciting.
And the 15-minute community idea isn't necessarily new. It's something that's been around for quite a while. It has a precedent in history, I imagine.
Yes. So what is interesting is that during COVID, everybody around the world, they heard about Carlos Moreno in Paris, about the 15-minute community, because they were able to do the shift so quickly and it's so simple, right? But when we're going back to history as part of writing this report, the initial idea was actually coming from New York in 1920. So it was Clarence Perry. So he was a planner working for the city of New York planning department. He was tasked to decide where would the city put in new parks. And he noticed that he cannot make that decision in isolation because at that time, that was also the time when the city is starting to have a lot of automobile. And they are facing a problem at that time, which is they are losing one child per day. So therefore, instead of come up with the recommendation of new parks, he come up with the recommendation of neighborhood unit. Basically, the idea is very simple. It's starting with putting in a new school surrounded by new park, and the school will be open in the evening and during the weekend for community users, and putting that in the heart of a community, but surrounding that with the local kind of mixed users and residential users. So that become a scalable template. So this is the model to us. This is kind of like the legacy actually is, going back to New York. So that's very exciting.
What was your reaction, though, when you heard all of the kind of conspiracy theories and such from Carlos Moreno's 15-Minute City and what was happening, during the pandemic and after the pandemic? Actually, we're still in the pandemic for the most part. But, what was your reaction to the conspiracy theories that were happening, during the pandemic on the 15-Minute City?
I think what is interesting is that in order to make this shift, people need data to make decisions. But because many of these is so new, so how do you get those information? So I think the conspiracy is that people try to understand what is trigger those decisions. Why are you, making this major shifts? But from our perspective, we know that over the last 20 years, many professions has made major shifts. It's not just professional planners, but also professional engineers. So in other words, they're not looking at, we are traffic engineers, we're transportation engineers. We're focusing on active transportation. So that means the numbers that they're looking at is entirely different. Instead of counting cars, it's about counting people. So because this is so new, so how do they, having a clear benchmark? I think from that standpoint is that a lot of that is about professional judgment, but also another part is that, thinking about how to collaborate and really kind of focusing on the outcome.
From the transportation perspective, we know how hard it is to get a bike lane or a bus lane sometimes. And I feel like it's easy to say we need to do these things, but how do we actually get everybody on board with these ideas? Because I know that for some folks, and some traffic engineers that might call themselves transportation engineers now, it might be a tough sell.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about the manual that we created is that we are using different prototypes to tell the story. So you can use the one prototype to kind of tell this strategy. So imagine you have a downtown. So now that a lot of people is working from home and the downtown has the opportunity to getting more diversified. So how to do it is looking at, is there any opportunity to transform those parking spaces into public spaces? So that's a start. The key is finding a way to create a new set of destination. Once those are in, then the decision about putting in bike lane or a new walkway become a lot more straightforward.
I really like that, though, the part of the report where you talked about the different geographies. And especially, from a ULI perspective, it's interesting to see what those geographies are. Because usually it's like the region, the city, the neighborhood, those types of neighborhoods. But you all have, exurbs, malls, suburban corridors, edge cities, and downtowns. Which one of those was the most interesting to you?
For me, the most interesting and also the most important one to put more energy is the region, is the metro region scale. So we see that across North America, there are more than 400 metro regions. So as part of this research, we actually studied the top 55. We try to understand what is the growth projection and also what are the infrastructure gap. We also look at affordability as well. What is actually, aging infrastructure that is impacting region as a whole. So what we see is that right now there's a lot of proposal coming down the pipeline, and generally triggered by metro region. Very often it's by transit agency. But in order for their transit case to be successful, land use decision need to be made at the same time. So that means it involves the land use decision of multiple cities. So I think in order to make this effective, there is opportunity to put some of the key land use decision upstream. For example, how many people and jobs are you looking for? What kinds of jobs? When it comes to economy, many of the region, they're competing at a regional basis. Like in other words, thinking about how many university, what's the kinds of attraction that you can create as a region. And all of those need a lot of collaboration among cities. Another element is modal split. So in order for transit to be effective, other than having different kind of agencies work together to provide integrated service, but is to agree on a modal split. Is this 20? Is it 30? Is this 50? How many of those movement is not by driving, but is by walking, cycling, and transit? So I think that's very important. Another piece is aging infrastructure. So we know the transmission lines, for example, in certain parts of North America is experiencing a lot of the blackout. So we know that this is only a symptom. There could be more happening in the future, and is really impacting not just the economy as a whole, but also life and safety as well, particularly in tower neighborhood. When there's a blackout, you have to find a way to get outdoors because the building can get so hot. So now we have this initiative. Some of those is coming from the Biden administration. During November, there are a series of very progressive white paper. One of them, the title is Game Changer Initiative, particularly thinking about how we can decarbonize the supply chain. So from that standpoint, how we can provide energy differently. Is there any opportunity to localize it so that you don't need to wait for major upgrade to solve the problem, but starting to focusing on more district-based solutions.
So you're really targeting, in the report, I imagine what developers can do, what developers can focus on because of ULI, but also there's other units that are in the report, like nonprofits and things like that. So how do you coordinate all of these groups together that would be important for making the changes that you're suggesting?
So what we do is we start with a walkable catchment. So imagine it's around a half-mile radii, and in certain area that's more dense, it could be a quarter-mile radii. So using that to define a district. So having a general idea, and we can call that the special district. Through the special district planning mechanism, there's opportunity to clearly define what is the growth projections, how much development, what are the kinds of infrastructure that is needed, and also importantly, who are the stakeholders. So that would include the local landowners and also many of the community members as well. Once you get that in place, then finding a way to have the public and private and also the community, the three sectors collaborate, become a lot more straightforward.
We're facing some really difficult environmental issues as well. And you mentioned heat, and extreme heat is kind of, I think, at the top of people's minds at the moment because of what's happening in the United States, specifically in the Southwest, Houston, Phoenix, et cetera. How can people use this guide to address those issues?
So in the guide, one of the prototype we call the edge city. So primarily it means uptown. So I believe in Arlington, there's some sample of that. So imagine that you have a cluster of high density, and majority of them, they're in the form of towers. Some of those are residential, but some of those could be just office as well. But they're in a very car-oriented environment. Like in other words, the streets are very wide. And there is not much amenities nearby that can kind of facilitate that walk to culture. So within that, what we see there's a big opportunity is part of the infrastructure dollars provide opportunity to use biophilia. So how you can within 1 year from a building operation standpoint, you can actually upgrade your building. So there's 3 ways to do it. You can apply the green wall in the exterior spaces or interior spaces or in a combination, and also the roof spaces as well. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is that very quickly finding a way to transition to renewable energy. So we know that now with district energy, the thermal system, there's opportunity not just to wait for cluster new development, then you bring in district energy. No, you can actually use that to retrofit cluster of existing GFA as well. So I think those are the very quick conversion that can be done within a very short period. And then the third element is about converting. So we know that there are opportunities to convert some of those vacant properties, whether they were former industrial users or office users to residential users or to become used for institutional as well. So I think all of those is about seeing the results in a quick way.
And malls too, right? Mall redevelopment. I think that's the most interesting to me. These ideas that you can take dead malls and you can turn them into something new or repurpose them. There's a huge amount of malls in the United States and in Canada too, I imagine, that are just kind of slowly deteriorating and they're sitting on this huge amount of land.
Yes. So in our research, we see that there are actually over 1,000 malls, and those are pretty big scale. But they are also strategically located because many of those are either have direct highway frontage or along some kind of transit line and has the opportunity to be, bumped up to be part of the rapid transit network. And they're also adjacent to existing communities. So from our standpoint is that we see that a big portion of them is actually going through transformation because the nature of retail has changed. So some of those is going through a total redevelopment and some of those is going through retrofit. And the opportunity for us is that we have studied some of the example in Dallas, for example. So imagine there's a mall and the mall is adjacent to the highway, is also adjacent to existing community and is surrounded by trail and is surrounded some water course as well. So right now the mall is vacant and the owner has tried different strategy, even putting in some of the recreation uses, but it's not really generating enough energy and also enough revenue for the city. So what can you do? So we see there's an opportunity to do two things. So we call that the small T of TOC, which is trail-oriented development. Atlanta Beltline is a very great example, which is basically drawing a clear delineation and a clear expectation so that everybody know there is a new trail and it's quite extensive. Like in other words, that can generate a lot of activity and how you can line up development along it. So once it's set up as a trail-oriented development, that means that those development potential can come in without parking. And within the kind of mall, there's a lot of surface parking that's creating a lot of heat, and also there's flooding issues as well. So how we can transform those driveways into streets. So I think those are the kind of like two elements to begin with to kind of set the stage, how to integrate that as part of the community. And then, of course, it's about retrofitting the space from, putting in community center users, library users. What we see is that with the aging population, based on our survey, our members is generally attracted to, 3 buckets of location. Downtown, because of the proximity to university, you can get the cultural stimulation, but also location near malls because it provides for the kind of weather protected environment year round for the activity. So I think, that is why we're seeing so much malls is going through major transformation.
When you're putting together this report and talking with all the folks that you talked with, what was something that surprised you about it?
What surprised me about it is the decision. Everybody knows this is a great idea, but it's like, who's going to start? And I think part of that is having a certainty of a district, an idea of a boundary is so important. Because without that, our decision, everybody's going to make the decision based on different geography, different set of calculation. Another part that surprised me is the timing of infrastructure funding. So taking school as an example, 30 years ago, our way of building new community is that we build the school first. We have a general idea of, how many people, how many kids, and we build those community facilities first because we know it's going to cost much less. And also by doing it from day one, you already set up a healthy tone for a diverse population. That model changed. And right now, what we're dealing with is that development comes in first. And we need to make a case and say, okay, all the surrounding schools, they don't have any space to add students. And then you have to go through a very lengthy process to get a new schools. So in some of the neighborhood, we're seeing even like 10 years to 20 years delay. So I think that is really shocking from our perspective. Another third element is the cost of time. So right now in some of the fast growing region, we're seeing a construction escalation at around like 24%. We're seeing the land value escalation from 15% to 27% to the really big extreme. So if you add all those dollars together, what it means is that if we're not making decisions in a prompt manner, the same set of development would not be affordable after, let's say, 3 to kind of 5 years of delay. So therefore, we see that in the past, it's not that people have nothing about this model. There are a lot of energy bring to creating a master plan. Everybody's trying to create a perfect plan, but many of that perfect plan become a booklet in the library as opposed to getting that implemented. So I think what is exciting about this time is that we structure this manual as a very short booklet. A lot of graphic is primarily focusing on upstream decision. And our goal is that executive is going to pick it up. And within 15 minutes, very quickly, flip through those pictures, they can kind of think about, okay, what are the local opportunities within our projects that I can starting to create this more kind of dense mixed uses environment. And then based on some of the factors that we're putting in, some of those factual and some of those is more methodological, like what need to happen first, why, and also who is going to do what. It create a very tangible, comprehensive network, almost like easily translate that to a one-page briefing note. So our goal is to make it very easy for executive to make a decision. Maybe it's around 15 minutes. Like elevator pitch, 15 minutes, you can grab a few kind of key leaders within an area and try to figure out, okay, do we want to get it started or not?
What's been the response to the guide so far? Have you had any executives pick it up and run with it?
Well, so far it's very positive. So we completed this guide in May and we presented that at our forum. And it's very positive. What we see is that there are some local area because the policies is also going through changes. For example, in California is getting as of right for mixed users. That's exciting. But also at the same time, how you can create viable mixed users. So that's the kind of gaps that I'm trying to fill. So there's definitely a lot of interest from that standpoint to use this model to apply to some of the kind of live project, particularly relating to transit as well.
Yeah, here in California, I guess we recently allowed commercial properties along corridors to be redeveloped. And that was another one of your geographies was a suburban corridor too. So it's interesting how those things weave together.
Yeah, what's interesting about the suburban corridor is that we see that usually it's transit coming in and say, hey, there's an opportunity to put in a BRT. But in order to make the case, land use decision has to be upgraded as well. So those are the area that, if you can imagine, has fragmented ownership. So some of those are larger developer, they have portfolio base of retail. And then there are also a cluster of smaller landowners. So they see the opportunity to put in mixed-use development, but they do not have the skill set. So where do you start? And then from a local community perspective, people primarily what they're looking for is if there's improvement about health, social, and education, then it becomes a positive story. So what they're looking for is really when there's new development coming to the area, what are some of the key amenities that can benefit them? So many of them, they are now working from home. So they're looking for walkable amenity. Many of them, they have kids that's going to go to college and university. They want to provide opportunity for them to stay within the city and town as well. So what we see is the opportunity to turn these kind of plaza spaces potentially into innovation districts. So that is a new way of creating mixed uses to bring in a new set of economy, and also primarily using that to create more kind of micro changes, but collectively it can have a big transformation.
I'm also interested in this timeline discussion, the timeline issue, especially as it pertains to the timeline for development and the timeline for infrastructure. Because one of the things that we thought about a while ago when I was working at the nonprofit, the Center for TOD, they're so different. And so putting in infrastructure is such a different time frame than putting in development, housing, or commercial development, that they often kind of butt heads against each other. And it's hard to figure out what comes first or what goes where specifically without kind of one tail wagging the dog of the other, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, of course it does. I think over the last 10 years, from a planning standpoint, we spent a lot of time working with our colleague from economic development, trying to make business case to justify why we need this money, why we need to do it. Now is everybody know we need to do it because there's seeding money coming in. So I think the shift is at how you need to do it. So there is dollars for infrastructure. So let's say it's water main, right? How big is the size? You have to make a decision now. When you are putting that in the ground, how you can avoid multiple construction along the same corridor, but doing a combined approach. So in the report, for example, we look at there's 3 pieces of key infrastructure that can be combined. First is about mobility. So when we're building complete street, is there any opportunity for us to integrate not just bike lane and walkway and seating and tree planting, but also the LID, low impact development feature as well, and also broadband, because you're going to need it anyway. Can you factor in one project? Another element is road diet. So through the report research, we also see that there's a lot of economic case. Usually it's the local BIA or BID. And they make a case and saying that if we do road diet with every $1 spent, and it can potentially give you, as some of the more extreme cases, is $100 return. In other words, the economic case is there. Why is it not happening? It's really about factoring in the same project. It's about leadership action and say, the street is too wide, it's hard to cross. We can use the space for something else. So that's one way to combine. Another element is that we see that flooding is impacting a lot of the existing property, and 20% of the flood is actually happening outside of floodplain area. Like in other words, you can't just rely on the flood map to confirm whether the property has issue or not. So from that standpoint, we also see the extreme heat issue. And extreme heat compared to other climate impacts is the one that is impacting people the most because it's constant and it's long. And from that standpoint, is there any opportunity how we can intentionally shifting from gray to green? So we're focusing on creating urban sponge. So in other words, is there any opportunity to use park spaces, not just for recreation purposes and paved it, but also at the same time, intentionally creating the green spaces so they can also reduce flooding and also reduce heat as well. And then the third element, I find that this is the toughest, but it's also the most impactful. We call it the community hub. So primarily, is there any opportunity for different services to be sharing under the same roof? So if you imagine you have an urban school model, and within the same building, you also add in your community center users, your library users, your social users, and health users. So in Singapore, for example, they have this model. And it also have a local bank and have a local supermarket. So that make it very convenient and also financially viable. And in our world in here, we see that there are certain jurisdictions starting to do that. And what we see, the key gap is how you're dealing with ownership. So in the past, people feel that they need to own the land in order to provide certainty. Like for example, the school is not going to worry about, they don't have the right to use the space. Right now, it's shifting from owning land to leasing spaces. So that model actually provides opportunity that your facilities can potentially expand as your need increase, but also the delivery timeline and the delivery cost is much smaller and shorter because you're doing a lot of micro scale as opposed to really big mega scale that takes a lot long time to plan, a long time to build, and it's also very costly to maintain. So those three buckets, in my view, if we can, make those into a tangible examples and then starting to kind of celebrate every time when we see there's these kind of project get started, we put more spotlight to it. To me, that will be a success.
What are you most excited about going forward?
Very excited going forward, looking at the next generation. We see that the millennials, the Gen Z, is now Gen Alpha as well. So
oh no, there's another one?
Yes. Very smart teenagers, and many of them are very concerned about the global view. So social corporate responsibility. They were very thoughtful. They ask a lot of great questions. They want to make sure every move that they are contributing would benefit the globe as a whole. So I think very exciting from my perspective is that this 15-minute communities model primarily should create a lot more opportunities for the next generation to take leadership. And we have 7 years to make the best effort to make the change. And hopefully we're successful and we can see a dramatic result at the end of 2030.
I hope so too. Well, the report is Building 15-Minute Communities, a Leadership Guide. Where can folks find it if they want to get a copy?
They can find it on the UrbanNet Institute website under Knowledge Finder. And as part of the launch of this report, we're doing a global webinar on September the 13th. We would like to welcome everybody to sign up. And all you need to do is to go to the URI website under events, and we'll also provide a link helping people to find a way to sign up. For the global webinar, we're going to do a deep dive of the report, going through all the prototype, but also having a fruitful discussion about how to make it happen. So some of the guest speakers, including Jim Fisher from Rodman School of Management, particularly focusing on leadership, and we're also bringing in other speakers as well.
Cool. And then we'll have links to it in the show notes. So get that in your podcatcher or on the website at Streetsblog. Well, Yvonne, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. And thank you for the report. It's great. And I hope that folks follow it because it's really important.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast. And you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.